Imagine you're driving down a busy highway one rainy night. Suddenly, a semi-truck completely loses control and smashes directly into you, and you're instantly killed. You blink and find yourself in a strange new world where nothing makes sense. You have no previous memories, and you don't even understand a concept of identity yet. You're a newborn infant. You live this new life and eventually pass away again, instantly blinking awake in yet another unfamiliar world. Only this time, you're a silicon-based alien living 1 billion years in the future. Still, this will feel natural to you, and as normal as it has felt since your first memories of this life. You'll never cease to exist because you are consciousness. We are consciousness. We are the clay from the pit. And the clay doesn't experience the flow of time until its mold takes shape. Today, we'll talk about generic subjective continuity, or we'll just call it GSC. Will our lives ever end? I'm going to address this interesting idea, which is one of the most compelling ideas I've run across, and something that's been very intuitive to me for as long as I can remember, though I wasn't really able to put it into words until recently. I received an interesting suggestion from a viewer after I made a point on my video on the 3 terrifying prospects. I detailed how we might repeatedly live on continuously, not through reincarnation in its classical sense, but as consciousness arising and bodies taking its form. If there's no afterlife or God, if there's no transcendence, and if we have no souls, then we simply die and that's it. We're examining life given the implications of all the evidence we currently understand. One should ask what we are exactly. Well, we are just consciousness trapped in a physical body. If we're only shaped by our biology and circumstances, then consciousness is more like unformed clay, before we begin to take on our various details, much of which is superficial to consciousness. It's not difficult to see that our selves aren't really individual. Even if awareness arises directly from the brain, consciousness itself sprung from a seemingly dead universe. If that's already happened before, it might happen again. And time isn't an issue here. And if it happens here, it might happen elsewhere. When our lives end, we don't experience the blackness or emptiness of death. There is no void in which we rest. We just experience the flow of time through causality, and apparently only consciousness can do this. Indeed, it's illogical that many consider themselves as experiencing nothingness or blackness. For a subject to experience nothingness would be a contradiction. This further leads me to suspect that absolute nothingness is an impossible state. But now we have to ask, if subjectivity doesn't transfer into a state of nothingness, where must it go? What happens when memory and self disappear? Well, it must continue to another subject, since time is linear to us, and because consciousness must be experienced by subjects. A quick thought experiment would be imagining a young adult put in cryogenic freezing and waking them up once every 100 years for a few weeks at a time. If they don't remember their dreams, they'll just have the experience of a months-old person after their childhood, even if their body shows otherwise. You can give them massive history dumps in between moments of awakening, but they'll still operate like a debilitated human if they don't have the years of formal experience as other adults would. So the blackness of sleep would make up no part of their personality. Only the weeks of learning in between would shape their identity. We are just strings of our experiences. Naturally, we might believe that they would become depressed or insane due to massive lapses in time, but their consciousness is all tied throughout his or her lifetime events. As I've stated in the past, I lean towards transcendental idealism, so that space and time are just features from our perception, that those features are necessary of consciousness. I'm willing to change my mind on this though, and I'll continue studying philosophy. So yeah, I'm going to mention Schopenhauer even in this video. I'm sorry, but I couldn't resist. I'm also looking into empirical views and how this might pertain to consciousness as well. If everything is based on materialism, just physical processes in the brain, I argued why we'll continue to exist in some form. Nature has the parts to recreate us, if we are just organisms shaped by our environment and experiences. Even if humanity goes extinct, consciousness can likely emerge again eventually, and will just be the unformed clay patiently waiting to be molded once again. Even if the universe collapses and restarts, we'd be dealing with a derivative version of this one, and consciousness would likely retain its essence. We would continue to exist as various intelligent beings, taking on various amounts of consciousness. The passage of time would be inconsequential to us, since we don't understand what it means for the non-passing of time. If you don't believe me, just think about how much time you felt pass before you were alive. Well, none, obviously. Even recollecting memories of your first couple years as an infant is probably impossible. Our perception of time is murky at best while our brain is growing. So this is the evidence of why I'm not completely immaterialist. This is why I don't believe in anything as spiritual. However, our perception of time has no meaning in our non-existent state. So if existence is merely the beginning and ending of our lives, and we're molded and remolded, who can say how many times we've experienced or will experience life? The only reprieve is that memory is broken between each body every time we die. So to firmly state this is separate from reincarnation, we won't ever exist as the perfect copies like this moment. We won't carry a soul on from body to body. We won't inherit karma. Consciousness itself will just embody whichever organism pumps out the next offspring. It's like we're molten ore waiting for the nature's blacksmith to shape us, and our consciousness emerges as we begin to cool. But every new version of us will just emerge from the same source. And when I say us, I mean consciousness is just one entity, one emergent property such as the will. I'm not sure if consciousness requires any locality, or if it can persist beyond the end of the universe. But again, if everything is derivative, for example, if every Big Bang is just a continuous cycle or our universe just oscillates, it could very well be this case. I've always had this deep-seated feeling of a form of this idea ever since I was a kid. Even when someone explained reincarnation to me, it seemed a bit interesting and frightening, but still somehow lacking. It seemed a bit too fantastical to be real. If we don't have souls, this could be the natural explanation for consciousness. It's been said that we are the universe expressing itself, and I find that uncomfortable, because we'll always be a consciousness as this sort of mold, trying to form itself. Who knows how long this can continue? What this means is that we're the ambassadors here. We think and feel for consciousness in our bodies. We're just fragments of consciousness trying to make do with what we have. We also know that some animals are conscious, and more consciousness may emerge over time. That being the case, we have this obligation as the most intelligent species to speak for consciousness. We should be asking what should be our end goal, as well as any sentient creature. We have to make these decisions, even if we know consciousness will persist beyond the human race. So, what should consciousness do? That's the important question. The implications here might be devastating. To some, this might seem wonderful, though I doubt that would include anyone watching this. To someone like myself, an antinatalist and extreme pessimist, this could be really bad news. It might give me pause to consider the big questions like, would I actually press any kind of red button? In this scenario, I couldn't push it, or I'd wait for better arguments. We now have to analyze the best and worst possible lives of all conscious beings. For example, if our lives are measurably better than other conscious lives that are, say, cannibalizing each other in distant galaxies, we might have to take on the role of occupying consciousness for better subjectivity to take place. But we still must consider that less sentience overall is better, if you're a negative utilitarian anyway. But if an intelligent species came to the conclusion of GSC being true, then they might start doing something interesting here. It would only be a matter of time before others arrived at this idea as well. First, if they believe life to be meaningless, or they find life a net negative, they might start purposely sweeping aside any possible unsatisfactory lives. Like a video game, they might reset their character until they get the most desirable subjective experience possible. This is assuming a civilization has mainstreamed this philosophy and its belief is commonplace. The problem will quickly arise when nobody wants to take the place of the wage slave, of the working class, of the person who must provide. They'll see someone has to occupy the undesirable subject's position, and they'll need to find a way to appoint subjects to live their lives. So I imagine the easiest way to do that would be to constrain that belief until it doesn't become the popular belief anymore. The people would repress the philosophy, even so far as to repress education, to control the lower classes. It's sort of the inverse of how the belief in reincarnation came to be and how it was utilized. Still, this might not cease the end of lives. We might see that alien culture crumbles one way or another if they adopt this philosophy in a widespread manner. But if they survive, it's because they realize the simple fact that GSC is universal and that life should be improved overall. Regardless of our own lives, they would be progressing the welfare of all consciousness by surviving and working towards something greater. They would be working for some greater good of ourselves. And if intelligent awareness has a privileged position in the universe, this would be the most important goal. They might realize, like we do, that contact with other intelligence is nearly impossible and not worth the effort. And wiping themselves out, this could be a net harm. Should they consider extinction, they'd be rolling the dice that other intelligent life is living in better conditions. And seeing how only one species that we know of, us, is capable of improving our function to such a high degree, we understand a combination of high intelligence with consciousness is very rare in the universe. If they come to a similar logical conclusion, they might have an obligation to stick around and play as the mediators of consciousness. They can possibly do more to prevent future suffering of other conscious beings with lower intelligence. Regardless of what you believe, we can advocate for negative utilitarianism and try to improve the quality of current life. It's the best for both outcomes. Even if consciousness is inevitable and it arises from a sort of single unified will, we can reduce the quantity of consciousness. And this, of course, is based on a shared universal perspective. So who knows the true rarity of intelligence? And now I'm just getting ahead of myself. But I'm all about the absolute picture. I believe we ought to try living the most fulfilling lives, whether this is true or not. If GSC is at least partially true, then we're stuck as eternally aware, experiencing something, because nothingness can experience anything, nor testify to this empty state. Consciousness requires subjective experience, which will always be us. And if this isn't true, then, well, why wouldn't you want to try to live a fulfilling life anyway? On a personal note, I'm writing a short story, multiple actually, quite a few, and I decided to fuse this idea with it. So I'm in the process of creating another channel, and these are stories where I explore wonder, terror, and a sort of phantasmagoria. So in this story that I was writing, I'm exploring alien life, coming to the conclusion of living under the philosophy of GSC, or at least a part of it, and also a greater threat pertaining to it. I'll give more information later on this alternate channel when the time is right, but it basically explores a lot of philosophical ideas that I often talk about, but in a fun way. In a, not so serious way. With that aside, I wonder what the writer and supporters of GSC would have to say about certain things. It would be interesting to hear their full perspective. For example, if consciousness is constantly transitioning at the moment of death, but there are no new subjects to be found, or not enough subjects, where does that consciousness go? It can't go to nothingness. It must be experienced somewhere. Is there a state of pure potentiality? Or do we just wait for the inevitable emergence from entropy? The other possibility is if you believe in panpsychism, which I disagree with here, that consciousness is necessarily embedded into our universe. It just takes on the background like fabric, and we are the cloth cut from it. Panpsychism implies consciousness occupying atoms, meaning everything is rudimentarily conscious, including inanimate objects. But would you really believe that here? That without brain function, something is actually conscious? Do you believe that consciousness could exist on a quantum level, perhaps, and it permeates everything? I'm more of a believer that consciousness exists somewhere at the collapse of the wave function, as some physicists have considered, but we should ask where subjectivity emerges or persists. For example, does our continuity involve something like lobsters? So I assume there's a spectrum of consciousness shifting in and out of each subject's brain. Another question, can this align with Kant's transcendental idealism or even Schopenhauer's? Is reality necessarily based on the continuation of subjectivity? This ties in with a line I read on the world as will and representation in regards to the plurality of the will. Here it reads, "Therefore, it could be asserted that if, per impossible, a single being, even the most insignificant, were entirely annihilated, the whole world would inevitably be destroyed with it." The great mystic Angelus Silesius feels this when he says, "I know a God cannot live a moment without me. If I should come to naught, he too must cease to be." Our reliance on GSC creates a kind of kingdom of God, but not in a natural or spiritual way. Once again, for the record, I'm an atheist. But would this imply that subjectivity was derived before our universe began, and is perhaps eternal? That's of course assuming we can't pinpoint a definitive moment in the very first conscious being's brain. Unfortunately, while GSC does seem intuitive to some like myself, a lot of it is currently unfalsifiable, and intuition may not necessarily be the truth. Quantum mechanics certainly demonstrates that. We can't verify GSC because our memories are wiped, and we can't explain consciousness. The difference between what I considered before I heard about GSC was that perhaps we had necessary identities. That after we cease to exist, nature would eventually rearrange us in such a way to rebuild us as similar versions of ourselves. But not using our previous subjective experiences, but because we exist as particular schematics and models as consciousness. Perhaps we exist in various forms, minus some superficial differences, but that would almost imply having a soul. But if everything is just naturally mechanistic, I suppose it wouldn't need to. Our personality and memories need only be wiped and replaced with more consciousness. My subjective experience before I began this life could have been the totally opposite of me, and the identities only emerge from our environment and circumstances. I, or we, could be constantly battling ourselves. Are we one consciousness, fighting to understand itself? Are we holding ourselves hostage? It's an interesting thought. Lots of questions to consider. Now, here's my critique of GSC. We might be erroneously comparing subjectivity within one life to subjectivity beyond it. Maybe it's not necessarily eternal blackness after death, but it could also be an unknown separate state from the experiences between our dreams and being under anesthesia. Because those examples are all taking place while we're still alive. Even if we don't have memories in that time, we have other subjects to track them. Experiences don't occupy the darkness between moments, but that's only true as far as we understand while we're alive. Suppose at the moment of death, subjectivity isn't continued into another subject, but it experiences the slowing down of time almost to a point of complete cessation, sort of like a black hole. Or subjectivity after death could be something different. Instead of generically jumping back on the train of subjectivity, it's absolved into absolution, a state of nothingness, beyond objectivity, and we just can't comprehend it. So, non-experience might not necessitate experience after death, and this could be separate from experience before life as we know it. All in all, GSC could fall victim to a heavy reliability of anthropocentricity. This unknowing is simply unintuitive to humans. Or suppose consciousness works more like a dial. Now, this is less naturalistic and more idealistic, and once more I'll reference Schopenhauer, because despite being a fanboy, I have my disagreements with some of his views. I believe he articulates a possible understanding of GSC. I understand this is not exactly a naturalist view though, but if subjective experience lies outside the brain as well, we might have to think outside of the box. So he noted in regard to the will that St. Augustine despite his naivete, recognized a tendency of things to bubble and surface from consciousness. Augustine wrote, "If we were animals, we should love carnal life and what conforms to its meaning. For us, this would be enough of a good, and accordingly, we should demand nothing more, if all was well for us. Likewise, if we were trees, we should not feel or aspire to anything by movement, but yet we should seem to desire that by which we should be more fertile and bear more abundant fruits. If we were stones, or floods, or wind, or flame, or anything of the kind, without any consciousness in life, we should still not lack, so to speak, a certain longing for our position in order. For it is, so to speak, a desire that is decisive for the weight of bodies, whether by virtue of heaviness they tend downwards, or by virtue of lightness upwards. For the body is driven whither? It is driven by its weight, precisely as the spirit is impelled by desire. Here, the will is always seeking satisfaction, but since satisfaction is impossible, it endlessly transfers through various forms, some conscious, some less so. The counter to this would be that GSC actually necessitates a lower entropy form of consciousness, where it automatically seeks new equilibrium states, jumping from one high structure to the next, like jolts of lightning. I tend to believe more in traditional entropy and the will, as it were, in something more unstable. So higher entropy consciousness could be this state of very gray, fuzzy understanding, as it comes in and out of being, and it's driven by this inevitable weight. It's subjective, but it's not really doing anything important, much like an atom. Could you imagine yourself simply as a single atom? No, of course not. And who cares? And why would it care? And let's entertain our next experience as something like a fire. We only long for more fuel while we burn, and this feeling of burning is our baseline. We wouldn't be aware of things, but we'd maintain a sort of directionality. Although we're not talking about neurons in a brain, we're just talking about a state of existence. So that could be the transition between consciousness and a sort of break between intelligent perceptions, possibly even a break from suffering. Experience itself could degrade and mutate. Think of consciousness as dissipating like heat escaping from a system. Consciousness could work like the second law of thermodynamics. In fact, the degradation itself may be recursive, a layered process that never really ends. But I admit that this doesn't really fit into the naturalistic perspective. But I'm not completely sold on absolute reality fully described in materialism. Also, I've built a framework for a larger philosophical model where subjectivity will degrade, distort, or fragment across states in a way similar to entropy. Instability, layered ignorance, and nonlinear suffering are the key principles to this. So you're going to hear a lot of similarities when the time comes for those particular videos. You might remember some of these details later, and you can revisit this video when you hear the subject come up again. Currently, I believe in a sort of modified version of GSC, where consciousness gradually loses complexity, or diffuses into lower order experiences, and not necessarily conscious ones. This might help repel anthropocentrism while maintaining some rigor in naturalism. The most important question to ask here is, does experience require awareness? If so, what is the most degraded state of experience possible, where there is no self-awareness, yet continuity still applies? Perhaps even if our brain breaks down, the information processing part of it degrades rather than disappears. This could also mean that most of the time, consciousness is not conscious at all. It's just waiting and lingering in the dark. Also, as I like to provide consolations on my channel, or at least lately I have been, here's one. A consolation to GSC is that even if our universe is eternal, it may emerge as something entirely different than anything we can expect. Consciousness could be a more unified state, or even a state where suffering isn't necessary. And if your identity doesn't emerge once more in this universe, if we can imagine you really are something quite special, and we suppose that superficial differences between individuals do create these identities, then perhaps you won't wake up in this universe once more. You'll be in a new one, and possibly a better one. But if not, you'll cease to be, although you won't experience a blackness, but rather an instant subjective experience in a universe where things don't feel off. Perhaps we'll wake up to a better tomorrow, who can say? Even the worst case scenario is a string of broken memories, so that allows us some time to rest. So if GSC is an accurate description of reality, we won't know for sure. We wouldn't be able to verify this anytime soon. Perhaps we're just like vehicles, and we inhabit the only model capable of inspecting its own parts. Unlike the less intelligent vehicles, we've found a way to open up the fuel tank and ascertain something that may or may not be us. Where is this fuel coming from? And how does this liquid transfer energy into motion? It's almost like we're only able to understand reality as solid parts, and yet we don't fully comprehend the nature of liquid, gas, or plasma. All we can do is stir the fuel around and see how far we can go. Maybe one day we'll understand how the vehicle truly works and where this fuel's origin point is. But anyway, I think that about wraps it up for GSC. Let me know if you have any questions or comments or anything like that. And have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.